It was 0547 on June 3, 1944, 2 days before D-Day, when 18 B-24 Liberators crossed the fog-choked skies above the English Channel, flying in tight combat box formation. The air was thick with tension, but to the naked eye, everything looked routine. The pilots flew their charts. The gunners scanned the skies. The radios crackled with clipped confirmations. Their target, an enemy logistics hub outside Cherbourg, deep in the heart of occupied France. But something was wrong. Beneath them, on the Normandy coast, German radar operators sat inside their reinforced bunkers, eyes fixed on the green-glow scopes of their prized Freya and Würzburg systems. These were cutting-edge tracking arrays, fast, brutal, and usually flawless. They could pick up a lone Allied fighter 120 miles out. But now the scopes showed nothing. No pings. No signals, no aircraft. The air was silent, too silent. They recalibrated, switched bands, checked power feeds, even turned systems off and on again in a desperate attempt to explain the silence. Still nothing. For nearly 12 minutes, the entire coast's radar net appeared blind. It was impossible. But then the first explosions hit. Bunkers collapsed under direct hits. A fuel depot vanished in fire. The sirens wailed too late. When Luftwaffe fighters scrambled, the B-24s were already banked into retreat, climbing into cloud banks like ghosts vanishing into fog. What should have been detected instantly, what should have triggered alarms, orders, defenses, was only noticed when it was already over. Back at Luftwaffe West Command, the official log recorded a rare phrase: Verlust durch Radarversagen, loss due to radar failure. But no one knew how, and no one had seen it coming, except one man. In a hangar hundreds of miles away, Petty Officer Alan Drexler stood alone beside a grounded radar dish, watching a second radar operator test a signal feedback loop. Drexler was a submariner, not an aviator, a sonar man. The Navy barely tolerated him. The Air Corps barely knew he existed. But for weeks he'd been testing an idea nobody believed in, an idea pulled from submarine acoustic ghosting and twisted into something airborne. He called it a bypass. They called it madness. But that morning, above Normandy, it worked. 18 bombers flew into one of the most tightly monitored airspaces in Europe, and for 12 minutes they were invisible, not to the eye, but to the machines, to the math. That mission didn't just drop bombs. It shattered confidence. Because if Allied planes could disappear for even 5 minutes, let alone 12, every radar doctrine on the continent had to be rewritten. The pilots didn't know it. Command didn't authorize it. But someone had bent the rules of physics just long enough to save a squadron. The myth still circulates, even in military archives, that by 1944, Allied radar was not just superior, it was impenetrable. That it swept the skies with impunity, immune to interference, decades ahead of the Germans in detection and jamming. It's a clean story, one that paints a picture of orderly technical dominance. But like most battlefield myths, it collapses under scrutiny. The truth: Allied radar had holes, gaping ones. And the men who saw those holes weren't always scientists or commanders. Some were wrench-turners, tinkerers, submarine techs working outside their pay grade. Men like Alan Drexler, who understood signals not because he studied them in a university lab, but because he spent years listening to what sonar couldn't pick up. Drexler wasn't even in the Air Corps. He was Navy, 3rd class. His job was to maintain acoustic transducers on submarines. But off-duty, he was obsessed with one thing: electromagnetic interference. He spent his nights in the bowels of the USS Archerfish, tuning loops of copper wire through homemade capacitors, feeding ghost signals into dead receivers just to watch them bend. He noticed something strange. At certain harmonics, German radar bands could be confused. Not jammed, not blocked, but tricked into ignoring inbound echoes. A shadow, riding just behind the signal. It didn't erase the blip. It delayed it by a fraction. But in radar warfare, a fraction was everything. When he pitched it to Base Command in early May, they laughed, called it ham radio voodoo. One colonel joked, if sonar guys were meant to fly, God wouldn't have sunk them. Even the Air Corps engineers dismissed him. Aircraft radar response isn't sonar, they said. What works underwater doesn't work at altitude. Drexler was told to stick to his lane. But he didn't. Because Drexler wasn't trying to win medals. He was trying to fix a problem everyone else ignored. Aircraft were dying at predictable intervals. German radar nets were too efficient. Entire squadrons were getting chewed up before they even saw a fighter. In April alone, over 220 B-17s and B-24s were lost in pre-engagement intercepts. The Luftwaffe wasn't smarter. They were simply seeing us first. Drexler's idea was simple. He wouldn't jam radar, he wouldn't outpower it. He'd confuse it by rerouting a plane's radar signature through a modified feedback circuit designed for submarine sonar ghosting. It was illegal, unverified, and brilliant. But in a war dominated by bureaucracy and rank, genius without a title meant nothing, until the day a radar scope showed nothing. And the planes dropped fire anyway. To understand how a submariner could blind radar, you first have to understand how the sky was wired. By 1944, radar had become the invisible architecture of modern warfare. On land, in the air, and even at sea, pulses of radio energy crisscrossed every battlefield like ghost fences. The Germans had their Freya early warning system, and Würzburg tracking radars, overlapping in a lattice across occupied Europe. The British had their famous chain home, guarding the channel since 1940. The Americans fielded the SCR-270 and later the SCR-584, sending ripples into the sky in search of reflections, metal, movement, anything unnatural. The theory was simple. A radar pulse shoots outward, bounces off an object, and returns to its emitter. From that echo, operators could determine range, bearing, and speed. But theory isn't reality. Radar, like sonar, has blind spots, null zones, refraction layers, and frequency drift. In the air, these were typically ignored or dismissed as statistical noise. After all, bombers weren't trying to sneak past radar. They were trying to survive it. But at sea, in the murky acoustic mess beneath the waves, detection was far more delicate. Submarine techs became masters of listening between the lines, and Alan Drexler was one of the best. On the USS Archerfish, Drexler's job was to maintain hydrophones and analyze acoustic distortions, but his obsession wasn't sound. It was signal. He noticed that under certain water temperatures, sonar pings would misreport depth or location. A well-placed echo decoy, called a pill, could make a sub seem like it was drifting hundreds of meters off its true course. Drexler wondered, what if radar could be spoofed the same way? The problem was scale. Aircraft radar signatures were massive and fast-changing. A bomber squadron lit up a screen like a parade. But Drexler didn't want to erase a signal, just shift it. Delay the return echo even slightly to create radar uncertainty. Enough uncertainty to delay interception. Enough delay to save lives. He built a prototype onshore using scavenged submarine parts. Copper coils from a decommissioned hydrophone array. Ceramic insulators from a busted depth gauge. And a tuning unit cannibalized from a broken shortwave radio. The result? A crude but functioning feedback loop that rerouted a plane's radar return through a time-shifted oscillator. It didn't block radar, it gave it a false reading. But he needed to test it airborne, and for that, he needed access to a bomber. He found it at a joint RAF-USAF base in southern England, where old B-24s were being refitted. Drexler posed as a technician and offered to assist the ground crew with wiring calibration. He slipped his device into an unused navigation circuit. When the aircraft was tested during a routine flyover of a British radar station, the results were staggering. The plane's echo appeared, then vanished, then reappeared 8 miles later. Operators thought it was a glitch. Drexler knew it was proof. One man, one loop of wire, one stolen frequency, and the myth of radar infallibility began to crack. Radar didn't just see, it predicted. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had perfected a brutal rhythm of detection and response. Freya stations, mounted on coastal towers from Calais to Cherbourg, tracked inbound Allied squadrons within 100 to 120 miles. Once contact was confirmed, radar coordinates were fed into Würzburg fire control systems, which fine-tuned targeting for flak batteries and vector instructions for night fighters like the Bf-110 and Ju-88. Everything operated on timing, and the math didn't lie. The average interception window? Just 3.5 seconds from detection to the first radar echo handed off for engagement. And that mattered, because it turned every bombing run into a countdown. Allied squadrons flying over occupied Europe in early 1944 faced staggering losses. In the 3 months leading up to D-Day, U.S. and British heavy bombers reported an average mission casualty rate of 18%. That meant nearly 1 in 5 aircraft didn't return. The worst day, February 24th, saw over 250 bombers shot down during a double-wave assault on Schweinfurt. Most were hit before reaching their targets, not by visual contact, by radar. German fighters were scrambled while Allied bombers were still 30 minutes out. Pilots reported seeing Me-262s and FW-190s waiting at altitude, like vultures in a storm. The only explanation was radar. And worse, radar was getting better. The Germans had begun deploying the Jagdschloss panoramic radar, capable of detecting entire formations and tracking them across hundreds of kilometers in real time. The Allies tried chaff, thin strips of aluminum dropped in clouds to jam radar returns. It worked for about 45 seconds. German algorithms quickly adjusted. Even electronic jamming had limits. The Allies used devices like mandrel and carpet to flood enemy radar with noise. But the Luftwaffe learned to home in on the jamming itself. A bomber that jammed too long became a glowing beacon in the sky. The numbers were unforgiving. The odds were cruel. By contrast, the mission that used Drexler's bypass hack, what would later be referred to as Flight Ghost, suffered 0 casualties. No radar detection for 12 minutes. No Luftwaffe intercept. No flak accuracy. Not a single direct hit. 1 squadron, 1 switch. A dozen aircraft, vanishing from German scopes without jamming, without chaff, without even altering their altitude. It wasn't magic. It was one submariner's refusal to accept that being seen was inevitable. Radar had rules. Drexler rewrote them. Because when 3.5 seconds decides whether you live or die, silence isn't just golden. It's survival. It was supposed to be a routine recon flight. Nothing fancy. A low-risk pre-invasion weather and observation run over the northern French coast. The kind of mission nobody wrote books about. But inside Hangar 12 at RAF Wittering, something extraordinary was being wired into the underbelly of a B-24 named Grey Reaper. Alan Drexler stood beside the plane's nav console, a battered canvas bag at his feet. Inside it, spools of copper wire, a stripped oscillator board, a detuned signal scrambler salvaged from a failed ECM unit, and a custom feedback delay rig cobbled together with submarine parts. He had 30 minutes before the crew showed up. The crew didn't know. Command didn't authorize it. This was, by every definition, an illegal modification to military hardware. Drexler wasn't even Air Corps. If he got caught, he'd be court-martialed. But the squadron's ground chief, an old friend from sonar school, looked the other way. Said 6 words that changed everything. If it works, I didn't see it. The hack was simple in design, but radical in concept. Drexler rerouted the bomber's radar reflective signal return through his oscillator loop, which introduced a nanosecond phase shift at random intervals. It didn't block the signal. It bent it, scrambled it, delayed it, just enough to register as atmospheric clutter on enemy radar scopes. At 03:16 hours, Grey Reaper lifted off the runway, part of a flight of 6 B-24s heading toward Cherbourg. It flew dark, no lights, no chatter. From inside the aircraft, everything felt normal. The crew had no idea they were testing a battlefield ghost trick. But 40 miles east, at a German radar outpost near Saint-Lô, nothing felt normal. The radar operator logged no new contacts. The skies were clean. Yet moments later, the station was rocked by nearby bomb impacts. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire wildly into the darkness, blind and unaimed. By the time the fighters scrambled, the B-24s were already heading home. Drexler watched from the ground. He had no access to real-time radar feedback. But hours later, when the planes returned, he knew something had worked. The squadron leader, still rattled from seeing no enemy fighters, delivered a strange after-action report. We felt invisible. 2 days later, a quiet British radar technician at the RAF Sector HQ reviewed the German response logs, captured through ultra-intercepts. What he saw made his pulse stop. Radar stations from Calais to Falaise had gone blind, not jammed, not noisy, just empty. No signal, no response, no trace. And the timing matched exactly. 12 minutes of silence, starting the moment Grey Reaper crossed into occupied airspace. It wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't interference. It was proof. Drexler had done the impossible. He didn't build stealth. He built doubt, just enough to stop the machines from seeing. And in a war where being seen first often meant dying first, that made all the difference. The aftershocks of Flight Ghost didn't explode in headlines or thunder through command briefings. They whispered through radar logs, mission reports, and the quiet panic of engineers who couldn't explain what just happened. On paper, the mission was a success. Bombs dropped, planes returned, no casualties. But buried in the tech logs were lines of digital silence. 12 full minutes during which no radar return was logged. Not by Freya, not by Würzburg, not by Jagdschloss. Drexler didn't claim victory. He didn't even file a report. He simply returned to his sonar bench, soldered a few more coils, and waited. Meanwhile, at RAF Baudsee, a team of radar analysts began asking hard questions. How did 6 heavy bombers penetrate an active Luftwaffe grid without being seen? How did they avoid night fighters stationed specifically for that corridor? And how did the Germans miss them entirely when their radar range theoretically covered every mile? The math said it couldn't happen. But the math was wrong. Radar theory assumed linear returns, predictable symmetrical echoes from a metal object. It relied on consistent time gaps between pulse and return, like a stopwatch. Drexler's bypass broke that rule. His delay oscillator injected micro-variations into the return signal. To radar, that looked like clutter, background noise, not an aircraft. And because it wasn't jammed, it didn't trigger automatic countermeasures. To the machine, the plane didn't exist. Engineers ran simulations. They reproduced the signal delay. They couldn't believe it. A signal just 0.07 milliseconds out of phase could vanish into noise. The entire system collapsed under the weight of one tiny misdirection. One tech at Baudsee said it best. "We built a net to catch eagles. He found the one strand where you could fly straight through." The implications were staggering. Every mission over Europe was now suspect. Every radar return could be a lie. Worse, if one man could ghost a bomber with scrap in theory, what else had command missed? But rather than escalate, the reaction was bureaucratic. The RAF flagged the anomaly as non-repeatable. U.S. command didn't even file it. Drexler's name was absent from every briefing. His circuit diagram vanished from the maintenance bay 3 days later. What couldn't be explained was erased, and so the secret remained unspoken. But the numbers never forgot. Somewhere in the chaos of war, 12 minutes of silence lived on, in the gap where radar blinked, and one mechanic proved the sky could be hacked. 3 weeks later, Drexler's design was quietly duplicated, but never acknowledged. An enterprising engineer at RAF Wittering, having seen the anomalous flight data from Grey Reaper, reverse-engineered the circuit Drexler had spliced into the B-24's fuselage. Without orders, he built 6 more, each one fitted into a bomber with no formal paperwork. They called them phase cloaks, a name scribbled on a parts box in grease pencil. On the night of June 29, 1944, a squadron of B-17 flying fortresses designated Strike Echo 9 lifted off from the airfield, bound for Saint-Nazaire, one of the most fortified harbors on the Atlantic coast. The Luftwaffe knew the Allies were preparing for an invasion from multiple angles, and Saint-Nazaire was a prime target. Its U-boat pens were hardened bunkers, impenetrable by anything short of direct hits. Radar coverage around the region was among the densest in Europe, which made Strike Echo 9's success all the more improbable. Radar logs from both Allied and Axis stations showed bizarre patterns. RAF radar stations briefly lost track of their own bombers mid-flight, while German Freya units reported phantom echoes appearing miles from their actual path. For a full 8 minutes, the formation effectively vanished from all systems. Inside the lead bomber, Lieutenant Carter Manning remembered the moment vividly. There were no flares, no searchlights, just silence. I thought we'd taken a wrong heading. Then the bombardier said, "We're over target." It didn't make sense. They dropped their payload on the U-boat pens, direct hits confirmed via aerial recon. Not a single plane was intercepted. Not a single fighter scrambled. Post-mission analysis from the Luftwaffe listed radar malfunction suspected, units 43-45 offline, power grid unaffected. The British knew better. A junior intelligence officer pieced together that each bomber in the squadron had been serviced at Wittering in the past month, and that each had been modified unofficially by a team experimenting with radar signature distortion. But higher-ups shut the inquiry down. Too sensitive, too risky to admit. If word got out, the Germans might adjust frequencies, adapt algorithms. The trick only worked if they stayed blind. Drexler was never mentioned. The squadron's crew never knew. But something had changed. Saint-Nazaire wasn't just a mission, it was a proof point. A quiet declaration that stealth didn't require new planes or billions in funding. It required one good idea, and the courage to plug it in when no one was looking. Ghost Squadron flew in full formation with full payloads into the jaws of the most advanced radar defense in Europe, and emerged untouched. That wasn't luck. That was math. Bent. July 18, 1944. Berlin, the nerve center of the Reich, was under the heaviest security imaginable. Multiple overlapping radar stations ringed the capital, feeding a central defense network capable of detecting even single reconnaissance aircraft. The Luftwaffe had reinforced the city's air defenses after a string of precision raids that had hit key infrastructure. Every square mile of sky around Berlin was watched, scanned, and accounted for, which is why no one saw the 5 B-17s that entered at 22,000 feet. The mission was code-named Black Echo. Officially, it never existed. No orders were filed, no flight plan recorded. But in the archives of a classified RAF division, a simple handwritten memo was found decades later. Deploy phase cloak on Berlin corridor. Test Drexler waveform modulation under combat conditions. Maintain radio silence. No counter-jamming. The aircraft weren't standard bombers. They were modified signal interceptors, filled with listening equipment, cartographers, and radar scientists tasked with one goal: measure Germany's best radar response in real time while cloaked. They flew directly through one of the densest electromagnetic environments in the world, and triggered nothing. From 0110 to 0123, 5 heavy aircraft passed within range of 6 separate Freya sites, 4 Würzburg tracking stations, and 1 Jagdschloss panoramic sweep. Not a single alert was sounded. Not a single radar lock occurred. German commanders later reported a dead zone across 11 minutes of flight time. 1 radar technician was arrested on suspicion of sabotage. Another was court-martialed and shot. The Americans never acknowledged the operation. But the payload wasn't bombs. It was microphones. The squadron mapped Germany's entire radar lattice using passive signal triangulation. The intel they brought back would rewrite the Allied electronic warfare playbook. In a post-mission debrief, the project lead reportedly said, "They've been building stronger eyes. We just gave them something not to see." But not everyone celebrated. Back at Drexler's base, the mood was tense. The more effective the system became, the more dangerous its existence was. There were whispers that higher-ups wanted it buried. That stealth this effective could destabilize strategy. Some even feared the Germans might reverse engineer it if they found wreckage. So the Phase Cloak project was quietly shelved. Engineers were reassigned. Files vanished. The modifications on the planes were removed within 72 hours. No medals were issued. But Berlin remembered. And in the chaos of post-mission German reports, amid the accusations and disbelief, a single note stood out. "If the enemy is invisible, we no longer command the air." That was the moment the Reich's confidence cracked. Not with bombs, not with fire, but with silence. In a war driven by overwhelming firepower and rapid innovation, victory was often attributed to tanks, aircraft, and production lines. But in the shadows, beyond the range of artillery or the scream of jet engines, a different war was being fought, one of frequencies, distortions, and misdirection. Alan Drexler never saw the Me-262s he helped outrun. He never stepped foot inside a P-51, B-17, or even a radar shack. But in a war where being seen meant being shot, he understood something no general could grasp from a map. If you can't be detected, you can't be destroyed. His circuit was primitive, crude, held together by wire wrap and blind hope. But it worked. He didn't invent stealth. He invented misinterpretation. He bent the rules of radar just enough to make enemy systems lie to themselves. Instead of outgunning the Reich, he made it guess. Instead of jamming its signals, he rerouted expectation. The result wasn't invisibility, it was ambiguity. And ambiguity at 25,000 feet was fatal. The Luftwaffe, for all its technological advances, never accounted for this. Their radar was their strength, and Drexler turned it into weakness, not by overpowering it, not by destroying it, but by exploiting its blind faith in its own precision. That's the verdict history refuses to write in the open. The most advanced machines of the Third Reich were undone by a coil of copper wire and a mechanic with a stubborn refusal to stay in his lane. And though his name faded into classified files and unmarked boxes, his invention lived on, in echoes, in silence, in the 12 minutes when death couldn't see. Because in the end, the most dangerous weapon wasn't the bomb or the bullet. It was the absence of a blip on a screen, a whisper that told the radar, "Nothing's there." And in war, when you believe nothing's there, you don't shoot, and someone lives. You've just seen how one overlooked submariner's invention, built from salvaged parts and sonar intuition, bent the very rules of radar warfare. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't follow protocol. He followed physics. And in doing so, he didn't just save a squadron. He silenced an empire's most trusted defense for 12 irreplaceable minutes. If that kind of improvisation could ghost Allied bombers past Nazi radar, imagine what else was hidden, lost, or buried by bureaucracy. Because for every name we remember, there were 100 Drexlers in the shadows, mechanics, engineers, tinkerers, quietly rewriting the rules. What happens when that improvisation meets speed? In our next deep dive, we uncover the true story behind the one-man turbine fix that pushed a stalling Mustang into a 760 mph dive, briefly outrunning its own propeller and making a German ace think he'd seen a new American jet. You won't believe what he used as a cooling bypass, and the German radio chatter is pure panic. Subscribe if you haven't already. This isn't just war history. It's the physics of survival, the math of defiance, and the mechanical madness that changed the course of World War II, one wrench turn at a time.